Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. Happy Bastille Day. It's the Friday the 14th of July. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 506 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will take a look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Ukraine claims to have shot down 16 out of 17 drones that were launched at by the Russian Federation overnight. Suspilny reports that air defences were in operation in Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk regions. It also reports that a person was injured and nearby buildings were damaged when a drone hit a utility company in Kryvyi Rih in Dnipropetrovsk region. Russia is stonewalling and talks about the renewal of a deal that allowed Ukraine to export grain through the Black Sea. Barbara Woodward, the UK envoy to the United Nations, has warned. Wagner mercenaries are no longer participating in any significant capacity in combat operations in Ukraine, according to reports from the Pentagon. 3 Ukrainian drones were intercepted in the Voronezh region, according to the governor Alexander Gusev. He said there were no victims, no injuries, and no damage. Roman Starovoyt, head of the Kursk region in Russia, has reported that a Ukrainian drone fell on the city of Kurchatov. He stated that there were no injuries. A car explosion has injured 3 people in a residential sector in the Russian city of Belgorod, and a public poll is to be held to decide what to do with the metal Soviet Union insignia that is due to be removed from Kyiv's monument to the motherland. The Agence France-Presse video journalist Armand Soldin, who was killed while working in Ukraine, has been posthumously awarded the Legion d'Honneur by France. The Polish Prime Minister has said that Poland will respond in kind if Russia closes down its diplomatic missions. That was in response to reports that Moscow had decided to close the Polish consulate in Smolensk. Finland's Foreign Minister, Elina Valtonen, has said in an interview with the FT that we in the West need to understand that obviously this is not charity because Ukraine is fighting for us. They are fighting for our liberty and the European security architecture. She said that the West remains committed to supporting Ukraine. President Biden has said that he is serious about prisoner exchange when asked about the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who has been detained in a Moscow prison for more than 100 days. And the Ukrainian army commander, Alexander Tarnavsky, has said that the Ukrainian armed forces have received the promised cluster munitions from the US to help boost the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Now, we're lucky enough to be joined this evening by Richard Thomson, who has been the Scottish National Party MP for Gordon since December 2019. In 2015, Richard became the leader of the SNP group of councillors in Aberdeenshire, serving as co-leader of Aberdeenshire Council until 2017 and as leader of the opposition until he stood down as a councillor following his election to Westminster. Richard currently undertakes the role of shadow SNP spokesperson on business and international trade. Richard, good evening. How are you?
Very well, thanks, Andrew. How are you doing?
I'm doing grand, thank you, Richard. It's great to see you this evening on Broadcasting Scotland. Now, our first item this evening is that the UK government has invited the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to the UK on an official visit in late autumn, the first such visit by the heir to the Saudi throne since he was accused of masterminding the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post columnist and dissident. Numerous UK ministers have been to Saudi Arabia in the interim, and senior Saudi ministers have also come to the UK, including the Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud. News of the UK visit, first reported in the Financial Times, comes as Saudi Arabia says it wants to end the war in Yemen and has opened up diplomatic relations with Iran. Saudi Arabia is also courting the UK vote in a November ballot to stage Expo 2030 in Riyadh, the point at which Saudi Arabia's 2030 vision, weaning the kingdom off fossil fuels, is supposed to be realised. The kingdom's chief rival for the Expo is Rome. The UK is negotiating a free trade deal with the Gulf Cooperation Council, of which Saudi Arabia is a leading member, and is anxious not to fall down the pecking order as Riyadh's key European partner. After a third round of trade talks in March, the UK said its analysis showed that, in the long run, a deal with the Gulf Cooperation Council would increase trade by at least 16%, adding at least £1.6 billion a year to the British economy and contributing an additional £600 million or more to UK wages. The UK visit also comes as controversy spreads over Saudi's alleged sports washing, including investments in Newcastle United, the expansion of the Saudi Domestic Football League, and the proposed merger between the PGA and Saudi Arabia's money-laden LIV. The golf merger is subject to US Senate hearings, with senators trying to see if it breaches US antitrust laws. The German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, this week announced he was not sanctioning the sale of Eurofighter jets to Saudi Arabia. In 2022, Saudi Arabia executed 196 people, the highest number of annual executions that Amnesty International has recorded in the country in the last 30 years. On the 12th of March last year, the government executed 81 men, including 7 Yemenis and 1 Syrian, in the largest known mass execution in the kingdom's history. Polly Truscott, Amnesty International's UK foreign policy advisor, said there must be no question of the UK rolling out the red carpet for Mohammed bin Salman, or of the Saudi ruler being able to use this visit to rehabilitate himself on the world stage. The visit could coincide with the 5th anniversary of Jamal Khashoggi's assassination and dismemberment at hands of Saudi agents operating in Turkey. Among numerous other cases, the UK government will have to confront the Saudi Crown Prince over is the outrageous jailing of Salma al-Shahab, a Leeds PhD student who is now serving a 27-year jail sentence for tweets supporting women's rights in Saudi Arabia. So, Richard, is this apparently planned visit? Is it all about money, or is it simply realpolitik? The Saudis are increasing in power and influence, and so every country has to maintain diplomatic relations with them. And of course, it struck me that the Saudi Crown Prince spent almost a week in Paris last week, and so that's probably playing in the minds of the Foreign Office, isn't it?
Well, I would imagine so, however regrettable that is. I mean, let's be quite honest. The regime that runs Saudi Arabia is one which has blood in its hands, not just the blood of Jamal Khashoggi, but also the blood of those that through its opaque justice system they put to death in horrifying numbers each year. There's also the ongoing conflict in Yemen, and I just cannot fathom, other than for reasons of money, why any government would really wish to extend the courtesy of a state visit in the manner which is being mooted here. Because for all that Mohammed bin Salman wants to portray himself as a modern leader, the regime which he leads is very much of a medievalist character, and he is not somebody that I think we should be happy to be seen doing business with in that sense.
Thanks, Richard. And you talk about the medievalist nature of the blood on the hands of the current Saudi regime. And as I said, last year, 196 people were executed in Saudi Arabia, the highest number of annual executions that Amnesty International has recorded in 30 years. So, do you think is there any prospect of Rishi Sunak or James Cleverly raising that bloody record with the Saudi Crown Prince when he visits?
Oh, absolutely none whatsoever. They will issue a statement afterwards saying that, of course, they discussed human rights and Britain was very firm and whatever it was firm about, but it won't make a blind bit of difference. And to be honest, if and it will be raised as a formality, the Saudis will understand, and it will not be raised in any way that is meaningful, and they'll get on to talking about. The mutual interest that they wish to progress. So no, I don't believe that visits like this, particularly with a regime like this, are going to do anything to advance human rights in Saudi Arabia, and we shouldn't be naive enough to think that that is the case.
Thanks, Richard. We'll continue to watch this story as and when the Planned visit is confirmed by the Foreign Office. Now then, the UK cost of living crisis is forcing more people to dip into savings to make ends meet, according to official figures showing renters are at the greatest risk of financial vulnerability. The Office for National Statistics said 3 in 10 people it surveyed were using savings because of the rising cost of living, an increase from a quarter of adults reporting this in late April. Millions of households across Britain are coming under sustained pressure from soaring prices for groceries, energy, and other basic essentials, with inflation stuck at 8.7% and food and drink prices continuing to rise at among the fastest annual rates since the 1970s. Highlighting the intense pressure on families, the ONS said 1 in 20 households had run out of food in the past week and had not been able to afford to buy more. 46% of adults reported difficulty making payments as the UK annual private rental price growth rose to 5% in the 12 months to May 2023. Moreover, the analysis found that close to half, 48% of adults admitted to buying less food when shopping, while 1 in 20 had, as I say, run out of food. Commenting, the SNP's economy spokesperson Stuart Hosey MP said the Westminster-made cost of living crisis continues to hammer households right across Scotland. This latest analysis from the ONS paints an incredibly bleak picture, with almost half of adults struggling to make their mortgage or rental payments. However, the picture is equally bleak when they go shopping, with almost half of adults admitting to buying less food. With an election looming and a Westminster-made cost of living crisis hitting households hard, voters are crying out for hope. But both the Tories and pro-Brexit Labour do not offer that. So, Richard, the ONS report, and that's based on surveys of almost 15,000 adults across Great Britain, showed that 92% of people surveyed believe that the cost of living crisis is the most important issue facing the UK. The NHS came second, and the economy came third. The climate crisis, environment, and housing came fourth, fifth, and sixth. So, if the cost of living crisis is the most important thing to 92% of the population, one might have expected a government to react to that sort of message. So, why do you think it is that Westminster is simply not reacting?
Well, of course, the Conservative government would say that they are reacting, but all too often it's the Scottish government that is the government that's acting and finding itself having to mitigate the cost of Westminster policies, like through some of the new benefits through the Scottish Benefits Agency and through the game-changing, or ought to be game-changing Scottish Child Payment. But all too often those actions in terms of targeting help to those who need it most are negated by the actions of Westminster. But I think what strikes me about that is it's very, very clear that people are struggling at the moment. And it's also very, very clear that sometimes getting the message that you might wish to get across as a politician is very, very difficult when people are focused on if people are focused on other matters. But I think one of the things that the real challenges for the SNP, particularly in the next election, is to explain why the Constitution is intrinsically linked to the condition of Scotland. And one of the reasons, and why who decides matters, and about how the outcomes of those choices affect things. Now, the UK government says that there are inflationary headwinds hitting economies right across the world, right across Europe, and that is correct, but it's only part of the story. We, uh, because of poor policy choices in the past, are paying more for our energy because we didn't chase after renewables quickly enough. But we're also paying the cost of the botched kamikaze budget of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, which has pushed the cost of borrowing up to uh, records levels that we haven't seen in a generation. I mean, mortgage rates are now up to about 7%. And what is if you're paying off a mortgage at the moment and you're coming off a fixed deal, as I will be shortly, that's a figure that will make your eyes water, because there's going to be more money being paid to cover the cost of money you borrowed to go into the bank than you have left for day-to-day essentials, and paying the family budgets. But the other thing here is that the inflation that we're seeing is being driven, yes, by the war in Ukraine, yes, by rising prices in energy, albeit that has come down in recent months. But in the UK particularly, it's being caused by a shortage of goods, a shortage of labour and a shortage of goods. And both of those things can be traced right back to the front door of Brexit, stopping freedom of movement and making it more difficult to import goods. And also, we're cutting our nose off to spite our face here, we've made it a damn sight more difficult to actually export and more expensive to export in some cases. Now, this week, well, a couple of weeks ago, at Trade Questions, asked Kerry Badenoch, the Trade Secretary, allegedly, about the increase in costs for the iconic Scottish seafood sector to export their goods because they're now having to pay for export health certificates from a vet or an environmental health officer every time they want to export a consignment of their product to the European Union, which obviously they didn't have to do before. And instead of engaging in that argument, Kemi Badenoch started wittering on about deposit return schemes and how that was apparently inflationary, even though it's not even going ahead now. Now, I don't know if the I don't know if she thinks that we export fish in glass bottles or something like that. I mean, it was just utterly ludicrous. And, frankly, it's utterly laughable that anyone considers her a potential leader of the Conservative Party, let alone the UK. I'm taking it as an example. Those are the sort of frictions that have pushed costs up in the UK economy in a way that it hasn't happened elsewhere. So these are very much homegrown inflationary pressures. And the trouble is, well, the government is putting pressure on the Bank of England, an independent, supposedly Bank of England, to tackle inflation by bumping up interest rates and increasing the cost of borrowing. Now, that's the only tool it has at its disposal, basically, to do that. The trouble is, as the proverb goes, when all you've got in your bag is a hammer, every problem starts to look like a nail. I don't know about you, but I don't know many people that are feeling that the cost of living crisis is affecting them because they've got too much money in their pocket that they haven't paid enough to the banks to borrow. It's utterly a ludicrous prescription, but basically we're in a situation where the Chancellor is complicit with the Bank of England, and its hands are tied in terms of the framework the government has set for it. They're going to drive the economy into recession to take the inflationary pressures out that are actually as a result of policy choices, not monetary choices. And we're all going to pay the price of that. And quite frankly, that's where it comes back to the decisions. I haven't given a very succinct explanation here. I accept that there are better ways to put this across, but I felt one of the beauties of this programme is you've got time to go into issues. It's one of the reasons Broadcasting Scotland is such a valuable addition to the broadcasting landscape in Scotland. But the inflationary pressures that we're facing are as a result of poor policy choices by Westminster. Do we honestly believe that any sensible government in Scotland with powers in those areas would have made the same choices and be subjecting Scots to the same financial pressures? I certainly don't. And that's one of the reasons why, if we really want to tackle the cost of living crisis, it's not just about changing the government, it's about changing the system, changing the rules about who gets to decide. And that means taking the power into our own hands and having a fully sovereign government held to account by a fully sovereign parliament.
Thanks, Richard. That was a very succinct summary of the situation, and we're grateful to you for it as well. But you mentioned their policy decisions taken in Westminster, and we're going to continue on that theme now, because Michael Gove strongly denied that planning for a no-deal Brexit had weakened the pandemic readiness, and he claimed it actually helped in evidence he gave to the UK's COVID-19 public inquiry. Senior officials in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have previously told the investigation that as scores of civil servants were switched to planning for the UK to crash out of the EU, work to update and develop pandemic plans was sidelined. But Gove, the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, and a lead figure in the 2016 Vote Leave campaign, said preparation for the EU exit was some of the best preparation we could have undergone for any future crisis. No-deal Brexit planning had a daily battle rhythm, he said, and made government more match fit for the terrible events that this inquiry has been set up to address. Roger Hargreaves, the director of the government's Cobra Crisis Management Hub, gave evidence that the government's crisis response system had been pulled out of shape by crises including planning for Brexit. 6 pandemic preparation projects were stopped or reduced as a result of Operation Yellowhammer, which was the no-deal Brexit preparation. Projects dropped included a pandemic influenza strategy refresh, which was supposed to examine how countries in Asia, such as South Korea, had dealt with previous coronavirus pandemics, planning for a healthcare surge, and benchmarking the NHS's preparedness internationally. Gove insisted that he had not seen any activity that has been identified that would have enabled the UK to significantly better deal with the COVID-19 pandemic that did not occur as a direct result of EU exit. Pandemic planning related to flu rather than a coronavirus, and when it was put to Gove that some of that planning would have nevertheless helped, he said, "I don't think that can be proven." Earlier pandemic planning exercises had recommended revisiting plans for social care, where more than 40,000 people died with COVID, including workforce capacity and infrastructure, but this was hampered by the no-deal Brexit planning. Gove said he did not know what it is that would have been different in that approach that was taken towards adult social care, which could have been anticipated beforehand. So, Richard, in previous evidence, Catherine Hammond, who was head of the Cabinet Office Civil Contingencies Secretariat, told the inquiry that officials had been distracted by no-deal Brexit planning. And the inquiry heard how Exercise Cygnus, which was the planning for a flu pandemic, did not meet at all while Operation Yellowhammer was underway. Last week, the inquiry heard Brexit preparations had forced Northern Ireland to cannibalise departments in the run-up to the pandemic, and evidence from Scottish officials last month also blamed no-deal planning for hampering pandemic readiness. So is Gove simply trying to spin his way out of trouble at the moment, and trouble which is ahead as this inquiry is going to run for several years?
Well, I think so. I mean, Michael Gove, his great political superpower, if you could call it that, is that he has a real fluency and an articulacy which he uses to try and make any old cobbler sound plausible. And, you know, he's very adept at it. There is nothing that he cannot say with a straight face in the House of Commons. And if he said that white was black last week, without turning a hair, he would turn up to say the reverse the following week without it. Now, of course, he's the so yeah, but I think this is beyond even his superpowers to try and spin that no deal Brexit somehow was the best training regime that governments could have in all parts of these islands could have gone through to prepare for the pandemic. And Gove is, of course, the man who famously said that the British public were tired of experts. Well, you can see why you would like people to adopt that viewpoint because we've heard expert after expert at the English COVID inquiry so far, uh, setting out what the shortcomings were, and it stands in terms of preparation. Now, it's some of that you have sympathy for. It's simply a statement of the obvious that we could have had bigger stockpiles of PPE, but these are things that degrade over time, and it becomes hard to argue why you should put so much resource into something preparing for what may seem a remote eventuality if it's impacting things like your ability to spend in schools and hospitals and in more practical senses and in the moment. So, you know, that you could never be completely prepared for something like this in terms of having all the equipment that you might want up on a shelf ready for any eventuality. But is anyone of any substance, of any credibility, and I don't include Gove in this, seriously backing up Gove's position here that all the bandwidth that was taken up, not just preparing for Brexit, but also preparing for the worst possible version of Brexit, of there being absolutely no deal and all the plates stopping spinning and hitting the floor simultaneously, that was actually the best preparation that we could have had for a pandemic. That just because one crisis was largely averted, that the worst case scenario planning somehow, that such as it was, that went on for that, was the best preparation for the pandemic. No, the best preparation for the pandemic would have been not to Brexit at all. And let's not let the UK government away with any of the cant and nonsense that come out of saying that they were able to get their hands on the vaccines earlier because we'd left the EU. That's absolute rubbish. And even if it was true, it doesn't seem to have made much dent in the English excess death figures compared with the supposedly sclerotic European governments that weren't able to move as quickly on the vaccination front. So, no, I don't buy this argument for one moment at all. The best preparation for preparing for a pandemic would have been to allow uh, civil servants to prepare for a pandemic, to think through the scenarios, to allow the civil servants to think about what the civil contingencies were. I've got nothing but admiration for the way that the health service, the care sector, the civil service, the machinery of government moved through the gears as quickly as they did in order to try and make the best out of what was a very, very nebulous and frightening situation. It's inevitable that things wouldn't go right, and that it's inevitable that there are lessons to learn. It's inevitable that mistakes would be made. It's inevitable that more preparation could have taken place. But just using this as a justification that the way they went about Brexit was all absolutely hunky dory and actually meant we were best placed as we could possibly be to deal with what eventually befell us when the pandemic hit. Us utter cobblers, and it's a measure of the man that he can even think about sitting in front of that panel and coming away with such obvious. Well, I'm not going to swear, but you can imagine what my words would be if I was.
I think we can, Richard, absolutely. Thank you. Now, this year's unrelenting bloodshed across the United States of America has led to the grimmest of milestones. It has been the deadliest 6 months of mass killings recorded since at least 2006. From the 1st of January until the end of June this year, the US endured 28 mass killings, all but one of which involved guns. The death toll rose just about every week, a constant cycle of violence and grief. A mass killing is defined as an occurrence when 4 or more people are slain, not including the assailant, within a 24-hour period. A database maintained by the Associated Press and USA Today in a partnership with Northeastern University tracks this large-scale violence dating back to 2006. 6 months, what a ghastly milestone, said Brent Leatherwood, whose 3 children were killed in class at a private Christian school in Nashville on the 27th of March, when a former student killed 3 children and 3 adults. You never think your family would be part of a statistic like that, he said. In 6 months, that's 181 days, there have been 28 mass killings and 140 victims. The 2023 milestone exceeded the previous record of 27 mass killings, which was only set in the second half of 2022. The US President issued a 4th of July statement from the White House in which he lamented the wave of tragic and senseless shootings in communities across America. The President said that he and the First Lady Jill Biden grieve for those who have lost their lives, and as our nation celebrates Independence Day, we pray for the day when our communities will be free from gun violence. President Biden repeated his call for meaningful, common-sense gun control reforms, including a renewed ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, and an end to gun manufacturers' immunity from liability. Mass violence most often spurs attempts to reform gun laws, even if the efforts are not always successful. The Republican Tennessee Governor Bill Lee has urged the State General Assembly in the wake of the Nashville school shooting to pass legislation keeping firearms away from people who could harm themselves or others, so-called red flag laws, though Lee himself says that the term is politically toxic. Passing such a law in Tennessee is against the odds. Brent Leatherwood, who's a former executive director of the Tennessee Republican Party and who is now head of the influential Southern Baptist Convention's public policy arm, wrote a letter to lawmakers asking them to pass the governor's proposal. As I said, nearly all of the mass killings in the first half of this year, 27 of 28, involved guns. Now, Richard, as the 2023 milestone exceeded the previous record, which was only set in the second half of last year, James Allen Fox, who's a criminology professor at Northeastern University, said he never imagined records like this when he began overseeing the database about 5 years ago. He said, we used to say there were 2 to 3 dozen of mass killings a year. He said the fact that there's 28 in half a year is a staggering statistic. Now, with that statistic only surpassing the previous record, which was set last year, do you think that there's a trend starting to appear here, a deadly trend?
Well, it's hard to say, and I'm not a criminologist or a statistician, and I'm not qualified to make that assessment, but it certainly seems like more occurring, and certainly that we hear a great deal more. And what a grim toll it is that you've just been able to read out there. And of course, behind every death, there's a family that grieves, there are friends who mourn, and you just wonder how, if at all, this can stop. For all that there are some Americans who cleave to their constitutional right to bear arms, you have to wonder at what point people begin to see that the problem isn't, it's not, as I say, people kill people rather than guns. It's the fact that people have access to guns of this kind. Now, nobody needs to own an assault rifle. Nobody needs to be able to discharge that number of rounds. You don't keep an assault rifle for pest control or to protect livestock. You certainly don't need it for personal protection. Um, it's the gun culture is just clearly completely out of control. And as I say, in the United States, and I just you just wonder how long this can be allowed to go on before politics moves in such a way that it allows legislators to really brush aside the power of the National Rifle Association and the sort of lobbyists who fund so much of the Republican Party in the United States, to brush them aside and to start to put some kind of control on the types of weapons that people are able to buy from you, and to be able to start decommissioning decommissioning some of these really dangerous firearms that are held in society. Because the problem here is the free existence of guns, the ease with which they can be bought, and the ease with which they can be misused, and the ease to which people can come to harm, even accidentally, through their possession. So, it's just absolutely mind-boggling looking at that death toll, and you just have to wonder how big a tragedy has to happen before finally American opinion is galvanised in such a way that the body politic says enough is enough, and prevents the sale of weapons that can cause further harm in that way.
Thanks, Richard. Those are some very good points that you make. Thank you. We'll return to Scotland now, because over the nearly 50 years of its membership of the European Union, the UK was subject to a wide range of European laws agreed between EU member states, including the UK. Those laws cover a wide range of things such as competition, workers' rights, environmental protection, and food standards. Having a common set of laws underpinned fair competition within the European single market and drove up standards across the EU. Without major changes to law and regulations on leaving the EU, there would have been chaos with massive uncertainty for businesses and consumers. The UK Parliament's answer was the European Union Withdrawal Act of 2018, which in effect copied almost all EU law and pasted it into UK law. The plan was for the laws to continue in practice until they were changed by domestic legislation, either by the UK's four parliaments, including the Scottish Parliament and Westminster, or by one of the UK governments using its powers to make regulations or orders. The body of law, thousands of pieces of legislation, is now known as retained EU law, REUL. The UK government originally wanted to sweep away all of this retained EU law by the end of this year. To do so, the UK government introduced the retained EU law Revocation and Reform Bill at Westminster on the 22nd of September last year. The original bill sought to repeal or replace upwards of 4,000 articles of REUL. It proposed that most retained EU law would automatically cease to apply or sunset unless preserved by legislation made by one of the UK's four governments before the 31st of December this year. The Scottish Government and many others criticised such an approach, as it necessitated a significant effort to first identify all the retained EU law that might disappear at the end of 2023 and then work to preserve it. The negative backlash to the bill was wide-ranging, particularly highlighting the significant risk to standards and safety posed by the sudden disappearance of so much law. In May this year, the UK government made a major amendment to the bill, removing the automatic sunset of thousands of pieces of potentially unidentified legislation at the end of the year, instead presenting a list of retained EU law to be revoked. However, powers given to ministers in the Act mean that important laws that provide protections for the environment, for animal welfare, workers' rights and food standards are still at risk. They are also significant for business and industry, providing the stability and certainty needed to plan and trade effectively in international markets. Due to these potential implications, the Scottish Parliament has twice withheld its consent for the bill. Convention requires the UK government will adjust legislation to reflect the will of elected representatives of the devolved parliaments. However, the UK government has now failed to respect the views of the Scottish Parliament on legislative consent on a total of 10 occasions since 2018. Now, Richard, one of the points I was making there was with regard to business certainty. The Institute for Directors said the speed at which government intended to review retained EU law was a recipe for bad lawmaking. As initially drafted, the REUL bill gave rise to a level of regulatory uncertainty which was unhelpful for business. Our own data, the IOD's own data, shows that half of IOD members would prefer the government to leave the existing regulatory framework unchanged. But Richard, it struck me that uncertainty was at the very heart of the Brexit project, the Brexit game, wasn't it?
Oh, without a doubt. And I mean, I'm pleased that some measure of common sense appears at last to have prevailed in this, because, as you say, the lunatic plans that Jacob Rees-Mogg had when he was a minister to suddenly sunset everything in EU retained law. You know, all the legislation that was passed to comply with EU regulations while we were part of the EU. For all of that to fall away without you necessarily knowing everything that had fallen away and what buttressing effect that had on other laws and practices was simply ridiculous. And it was a recipe for absolute chaos in the courts for years to come. So the fact that this has now been incorporated into legislation is, it was the only pragmatic outcome that there could be, and it just showed how much of Brexit was driven by vandalism and trying to think of the right word here. You're just this exceptionalist mindset and the ideological fixatedness that your Rees-Moggs and others had on the idea that if something had been passed as part of the EU, the corpus of EU retained law, therefore it must go, not because of anything that it does or doesn't do, but simply because it originated from a requirement to legislate in line with our single market obligations, was just absolutely mental. So, the fact that we've got to a slightly better place in this is, well, a relief. But I think it shows how low the bar is that we can take something like that as a relief. Because for months, if not years, Tory ministers and Tory backbenchers were assuring us this would all be fine, that it could all just happen, that there was no threat to devolution in any of this. Anyone who suggested otherwise was just scaremongering. Um, but they really have been playing fast and loose with this, and it's a bit like basically ripping all the wires out of the fuse box and hoping that everything still works as it did before. That was never going to happen. So I think what they have done, rather than taking back control, in many respects, they've given away control. And of course, the threat to have a bonfire of EU regulations that we'd been nurtured on over 40 years or more to blame for every single thing that went wrong in the UK, from the shape of bananas to the availability of tomatoes and God knows what else in between. Um, it was there for a reason, uh, and so trying to perpetuate the idea that we could ever just dispense with that overnight, with there being no impact, no implications, no downside, was just never ever realistic, and it just shows the vacuum, the deficit of honesty that has been at the heart of the Brexit project from day one.
Thank you, Richard. Now then, we'll spend the rest of the programme this evening looking at a new independent report which has mapped out the sheer scale of the opportunity in Scotland to deliver a step change in sustainable economic growth. The roadmap for a Scottish Green Industrial Strategy identifies a window of opportunity to fully deliver on the potential of the Scottish economy, but recommends two essential steps to kickstart this process. The report recommends a specific focus on higher education and alternative energy, which should be seen as the first treads on a strategic staircase for growth in value added and productivity. And the other major analysis suggests that a step change in growth can be driven by the formation of a powerful new partnership between key economic sectors and the Scottish Government. The document was commissioned by Ian Blackford MP and was led by Sir Martin Donnelly, former Permanent Secretary at the BEIS and DIT, and also former President of Boeing Europe, and Professor Dominic Holder, the Adjunct Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at London Business School. The independent report's core recommendation advocates the formation of a central delivery mechanism, a new Scottish Industrial Strategy Council, at the very heart of the Scottish Government, formed, led, and accountable to the First Minister. Ian Blackford commented, "This report points the path to a different, more sustainable and stronger economic future, building on the huge assets that already exist in the Scottish academic sector, as well as fully utilising the unfolding but immediate potential in green energy and industry." Since coming to office, the First Minister has clearly identified that opportunity, and he has moved swiftly to reset relationships with the business community. That new partnership with business is very much mirrored in the recommendations of this report. Now, Richard, Ian Blackford notes at the start of the paper how the economic history of Scotland over the last century has been one of underperformance relative to our potential opportunities. The experts also say that it has underperformed economically compared to similar sized economies in northwest Europe. Ian Blackford said, "It is my firm belief we require a renewed focus on sustainable economic growth, not simply for its own sake, but to deliver prosperity for our people and for society." Now, it struck me that economic underperformance everywhere except in the southeast of England has been Westminster government policy, Labour and Tory, for at least the past 40 years, hasn't it?
No, I think there's a compelling case can be made for that. That is the policy priorities of successive Westminster governments has been to say that if London and the South East, and particularly the City of London, does well, then somehow the rest of the UK does well out of that. And there's no getting away from the fact that the massive tax surplus that London and the South East, but particularly London, generates simply because of the concentration of corporate headquarters, which are there, which are of course there because of there's a government there to influence, so that it acts as a almost like a the drain in the bath. You know, there's a vortex that just sucks everything in there. You know, human capital, financial capital, and you know the region prospers. It's not without its problems, but it prospers because of that. And other parts of England have suffered greatly from that. Wales has suffered greatly. Scotland has been a separate growth pole of its own. Scotland has prospered despite that, not as much as it could or should have done. But I think our benefit there is we benefit both from proximity and also from distance and our separate institutions of government and our traditional areas of economic strength, which have always existed away from London. So yes, I think that there is a but you could, when you look at the figures, in particular, the one that struck me that Ian Blackford highlighted this forward to the report was simply to point to the lack of growth of population in Scotland relative to the rest of Great Britain over an extended period. And there are many, many reasons for that. But one of the key ones is the lack of economic opportunity that there's been. Now, we could go back a long way. Now, Scotland was arguably the first country in the world to industrialise through the Industrial Revolution because of various reasons for that. But it was particularly one of the reasons Glasgow and Lanarkshire industrialised at the time and at the pace that they did was the proximity of coal and iron ore to each other. So the steel industry developed as well, which led on to the heavy industry in Clydeside. Now we became vulnerable because that initial advantage was not a comparative advantage over many other parts of the world once they industrialised. But we also had a weak industrial class that hid behind imperial tariffs. I'm really digging into the depths of that Stirling University history degree now. But they hid behind imperial tariffs, relied on rearmament after World War One to keep the shipyards going. They did not invest in the right types of technology to maintain a competitive advantage relative to the rest of the world. And so we have this mythology of Scotland as an industrial powerhouse. Yes, it once was, but the history has been one of decline, of relative economic decline, despite our relative prosperity, but also that population decline relatively, and a story of emigration in large part for so many years. Those with get up and go were often ones who got up and went, or too many of them were, and that deprived us of much talent and vigour and opportunity. So you know, I'm an optimist, despite the gloomy history lesson. I'm an optimist, and there's a lot of optimism comes out of this paper in terms of seizing the industrial opportunities that are before us that are scalable, and that's particularly the case in green energy and hydrogen and tidal energy, which I know Ian Blackford has a very, very strong interest in. He's been an extremely powerful voice at Westminster on behalf of the nascent tidal power industry, both as the SNP group leader and afterwards in his new capacity. So I think having somebody with Ian's background who understands instinctively, innately, the scale of the challenges, who knows the history, who understands the opportunities that are there, but also crucially comes with that financier background, and he's able to see some of the gaps that are there. So you can see the opportunities, but how do you innovate out of university so that you don't just accumulate that intellectual property, that you don't just develop spectacular, stellar talents in academia and research, but actually that we're able to commercialise it? How do we bring finance to the table in order to do that so that we are the ones who capitalise on our discoveries rather than having that intellectual property bought up and commercialised elsewhere? Because they identify in the paper two of the areas where we do have a real strengths. One of them is in our research universities, and the other one in our academic base, and the other one is particularly in terms of our renewable energy because of our position in the world, the climate that we have, the geographic features that and climatic features that we have. So bringing that together with a better, a more joined up approach across partners in the economy, whether that's government, business, the renewed relationship there, relationship with the trade unions, and how we can all work together to bring these opportunities to fruition, where too many opportunities have perhaps slithered through our fingers in the past. And the other, the one thing I would take out of this report, that I hope people will take out of it, wherever they sit on the political spectrum between hardcore unionism and hardcore nationalism and support for Scottish independence. Where Ian sits on this, where I sit on this, there's absolutely no question about that. We want independence, we want it yesterday. We're working as hard as we can to get it. But he does make the very generous but also realistic point that the Scottish and UK governments have managed to work together over things like investment zones, over free ports, over the city region deal programme. And much as I would prefer there to be one government in charge, or for that government to be based in Scotland, there are things that are going to inevitably cross over into reserve powers when it comes to giving Scotland the green industrial strategy that we need. So we're going to have to, until we're independent, we have to work with the governments that we have, whether we necessarily like them or not. So having this group that can come forward with a set of the asks and what needs to happen in reserved areas, I think is important. And the one thing I hope is that we don't get the typically brain dead response that we get from folk like Alistair Jack, who anytime you utter a syllable about a power that is reserved, somehow that's a constitutional battle. I would like to see that kind of mindset part because it advances nothing, it convinces nobody. Can we not just agree that these are the things that need to happen? There is a constitutional debate, it's not going away. We'll have that in another day. But on these things that we can surely all agree on in terms of what are the best outputs, what can secure the best economic future for Scotland in or out of the Union, can we not at least agree that while that constitutional debate goes on, even in these areas that are outside the scope of the Scottish Government, there are actions that could productively and positively be taken? And, you know, taking it back to the constitutional argument, if that doesn't happen, that's grist to my particular mill. But frankly, I can make the case for Scottish independence irrespective as to that, because it's based on those who've chosen to make their lives here are fundamentally best placed to take the best decisions for Scotland, to get the best outcomes for Scotland and all those who choose to make their lives here. But where there is that power over those powers overlapping, and where there's the demarcation of powers between Scotland's two governments, let's work together on that. And there are a number of things that have been picked out of this that Ian highlights in this report, and the authors highlight in this report, where actions could conceivably be taken. And I hope that gets a proper hearing at Westminster. It doesn't dilute the argument for independence in any way, shape, or form to recognise the constitutional reality that we're living within at the moment. Let's, for the sake of our future prosperity, let's get on with dealing with those matters. And nothing would give me greater pleasure in an independent Scotland to be dealing with a bill about retained UK law and then deciding what we do about that in the future. But those are future arguments. Well, they're also current arguments. There's an urgency to seize these opportunities before others seize them ahead of us and in a better way and secure the prosperity for themselves. In the same way that, in the way that Denmark has with its wind turbine industry, that should have been ours. Why on earth it started in Denmark? Laxity, complacency, poor governance. We didn't get off the mark quickly enough. Let's not make the same mistakes with hydrogen, certainly not with tidal power, because we have an example, not just to set for the rest of the world. We've got a few bucks to make out of this in the process, and I very much hope it's us that does it rather than anywhere else in the world.
Thank you, Richard. Well, if we've got time, we'll come back to Alistair Jack, because I was going to talk about him with you. But having an MP for the northeast of Scotland means that it's really important that I talk to you about one of the three planks in the report published this morning, which I know you've touched on it already, which is energy and green energy policy. The report says, in alternative energy, we need to see onshoring of critical enabling technologies in wind and green hydrogen, so that the sector is not just a major player in energy output, but also a strong international competitor in the relevant technologies, where the competitive race still remains open, very much the point you were just making. Now, it struck me that with its refusal to prioritise the Acorn carbon capture project at Peterhead, it rather looks like Westminster is determined to slow down or prevent Scotland competing in the technology underpinning the renewables revolution.
Well, it very much feels that way, and I've sat with increasing frustration when Acorn wasn't included in the Track 1 clusters, despite the fact it was as ready to go, if not more so than any other projects that were there. We were told it was Track 1 reserve, and most recently I asked the Energy Minister, Graham Stewart, if he could explain the difference for me between that Track 1 reserve project and a Track 2 project, and he couldn't. So basically, uh, Acorn is effectively a Track 2 project. And the tragedy is that we've been ready to progress on carbon sequestration, carbon capture and underground storage projects in the northeast of Scotland for over a decade now. We were promised that if we voted no in the independence referendum, that this would, that the government, the UK government, would be pressing ahead with it directly. Well, that feels like, I don't know how it feels to you, Andrew. To me, that feels like over a generation ago that we were hearing that kind of thing. But I think that the report gets it absolutely right there. It's easy to get dazzled about the scale of the potential for Scotland in renewable energy. But if all we're doing is harnessing the natural resources, that's great, that's necessary, that's important. But if we're not commercialising that, if we're not industrialising that, if we're not developing the technology ourselves, if all we're doing is importing it and having multinational companies plonk it out there, and we'll maybe see a slight, we'll maybe see the benefit in our electricity bills, perhaps, then it's a missed opportunity. Now, I don't buy the criticisms that have been made of Scotland. I think a lot of the criticisms about Scotland, particularly from other notionally independent supporting parties are out there, are quite disingenuous because they appear to me to ignore the the cost of capital and, of course, the fact that the Scottish government can't borrow. But even if it could, there would still be a cost of capital associated with that. So selling the royalties and catching a share of the profits that are on the way past, I think is a decent way to go about it. And that, of course, is only 25 gigawatts of the potential that we have that is covered by the current Scotland round. But I think there is a valid criticism in there, nevertheless, that there is a danger that if all we do is harness the energy without harnessing the industrial opportunity that goes with it, without developing the intellectual capital, without being able to export that and monetize that, capitalize on that, then really all we are is just another. We'll be an energy-rich country, but we will not have the half of the benefits that we should be getting out of this, because we shouldn't just be seeing this happening in Scotland. We need to see it happening around the world for the sake of the planet. And I very much hope it's Scottish companies and Scottish engineering expertise and Scottish engineers that are the folk who are very much at the forefront of that. And in order to get there, we can't just sit back and wait for it to happen as if it's all just going to blow into our lap. It simply isn't. And this document, I think, with the, the, the proposals it has round about governance in terms of how it brings the various key sectors together, I think it can take us much closer to being able to achieve that vision. But let's be realistic. There's a lot of hard yards to be put in yet.
Thank you, Richard. Now, I said we would try and come back to Alistair Jack, so if we can, we'll do it very quickly. I'm just watching the time. The report concludes it will also require the government, the Scottish government, to set out this new story for Scotland's future growth to global investors and entrepreneurs, as well as to the communities and individuals across Scotland who can make this happen and build a more prosperous and inclusive society for all people living here. Now, setting out this new story to global investors and entrepreneurs, not if Alistair Union Jack has his way, will the Scottish Government be able to speak to global investors and entrepreneurs?
Well, exactly. I mean, I think an incredible sort of whiny crybaby response we've had from our supposed muscular unionists about the presence of Scottish trade missions around the world. Now, of course, what they would hope that nobody understands is that many other sub-state governments, to use the technical academic jargon, also have these trade bodies. They're not embassies, but these outposts. Flanders does it, Wallonia does it, Catalonia does it, the Basque Country does it, Northern Ireland does it, and so Scotland is not in some way an outlier because it seeks to have that international presence in terms of trying to secure trade and investment. And the evidence is that it works because outside of London and the southeast, Scotland has the highest level of foreign and direct investment of any other part of the UK. Now that doesn't happen because Alistair Jack, tells us to get back in our box. It happens because people are out there working hard on Scotland's behalf. Yes, using the diplomatic service networks that are out there, but also by making direct connections, as many other nations equivalent to Scotland that are not independent themselves also do. But the biggest laugh of all of this is that hearing uh, hearing folk like Stephen Kerr, who's one of the worst offenders, bloviating away about how the Scottish Government is wasting money on these things. The first Scotland Europa office opened in Brussels in 1979. Can we remember who took office in the UK in 1979? Because I can. And when the office expanded in 1992, who was still in government in 1992 when that happened? Who was the Secretary of State for Scotland? It was Ian Lang. Another imperial viceroy representing a seat in the southwest of Scotland. So I don't know why the idea of Scotland having an international presence has suddenly become so toxic. I just think that there's the Tories that they've got now. They've become so addled in their fear of Scots exercising a right to self-determination that they see gnats in the belfry, if I could put it that way, wherever they go. And really, I think they just need to, keep lie down in a darkened room and just realise that what goes on is nothing except, well, it is exceptional, but it's not exceptional in terms of what other areas equivalent to Scotland do, other nations equivalent to Scotland do. It's for all of our benefit, and really they should stop picking constitutional fights and get on with the day job. That would be my best advice to Alistair Jack.
Thank you, Richard. That's some fantastic advice to Alistair Jack to finish the programme with this evening, because that's all that we have time for. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 in order that we can continue to pay the bills. To everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. We will be back on Sunday at 12 noon sharp for the next edition of the Full Scottish, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who has been watching this evening, and I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special guest, Richard Thomson MP. Thanks, Richard.
Great pleasure, Elizabeth.
Please look after yourself, and please have a very peaceful weekend. Bye-bye.